I am the editor of World Affairs Brief. It's a publication that I began back in about 1984 when I was chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C. This was during the Reagan administration. And even though Reagan is considered the most conservative American president, he made a lot of unwise compromises to the establishment, and my purpose there in the Conservative National Committee was to try to stop this move to compromise. And while I was in Washington, I had developed a lot of sources around the world, especially in Latin America, where I was influential in developing some free market political parties there in El Salvador and Guatemala. My passion is real liberty, even though I am a proponent and a fan of the U.S. Constitution. I don't think it goes far enough in terms of defining what true fundamental rights are. And so I have written extensively in the political field. I am a political scientist by training, on how to design a constitution that stops the slow encroachment of socialism so that true free liberty among all people is equally, and I'm not for, I should say, the kind of false free market economics of the globalists that promote what is really a form of corporatism, freedom for corporations to spread their control around the world, but not freedom for the individuals, which is what I'm for, which goes against corporatism or mercantilism. So I am very much concerned about the globalists. I think they are a form of socialism. They preach free markets, but they really don't believe in. They believe in control. That is, you still think you're free, but we want to control you. And so they have been building, in my opinion, a conflict scenario through the war on terror and through funding and supplying arms to their future enemies in Russia and China. And so that's my major focus in the World Affairs Brief, is how this globalist conspiracy for power and conflict will affect us in our lives.
I was at dinner the other night, Joel, and I mentioned your name and Alex Jones in a conversation that was taking place during the evening, and I was laughed at because your names are associated with the Tea Party. Now, would you just explain to me your position with the Tea Party and what the Tea Party actually is?
Well, actually, I would never be associated with the Tea Party because the Tea Party is rather a populist movement. Populism is basically appealing to the popular will of the people at the moment, and that's not a principled position. My position has always been a libertarian position. It's been principled, it's consistent, it doesn't change with what becomes popular. So much of the Tea Party is what we would call traditional conservatism in the United States, which is pro-religion, pro-family, but I do not believe, for example, imposing religious views, even if correct, upon people through government power. Government's only role is to defend fundamental rights. It cannot provide benefits. It cannot enforce religious values upon people unless what they're enforcing is in protection of a fundamental right. In other words, a person has a right to corrupt themselves. If they want to do drugs in the privacy of their home, they should be free to do that. Even though I personally don't like drugs, people need to be free to fail. They need to be free to corrupt themselves as long as they're on their own property and they're not infringing upon the rights of other people, their neighbors, or their children. In other words, their children do have certain rights against being abused, and government can intervene in limited circumstances there. But so my views are quite different than from the Tea Party. The Tea Party is just traditional U.S. conservative mixed with Christian ideals, and I don't believe in mixing religion with government policy except to defend fundamental rights.
Am I correct, however, to ascertain that you you do regard yourself as a Christian?
I am. I am a Christian, but I don't believe in imposing that upon anyone else in any way. Now, Alex Jones is, I consider him a friend. He interviews me quite regularly. But Alex, does have some lack of control issues in terms of, getting extremely angry and upset. And I think that gives his enemies a great deal of advantage over him in terms of being able to discredit him. Now, Alex Jones and his organization gives out perhaps some of the best alerts as to what's coming off in terms of the future. I don't agree with many of the conclusions, though, that they derive from that, particularly anything that proclaims that war is imminent or that martial law is imminent or that these types of preparations for tyranny are going to come crashing down at any moment. I think it's a long, slow process of corrupting the body politic, preparing, yes, to take down dissidents. I think that's what NSA spying is all about. It's not about terrorism, which is more or less a government-controlled false opposition or false conflict creation. But I take a long-term view of what the globalists, I think, are up to and what their plans are. And so far, I've got a very good track record for being right.
Okay, so as you know, I'm sitting in Europe. I bounce between London and Spain predominantly. So I would like to speak to you about the Ukrainian situation, your views on it. From the perspective of someone in London, we would view, or the conversation that I'm having, is that the Russians have invaded the Ukraine, and they're trying to start a war there with the Ukrainian government. However, when I dig a little bit deeper, that's not as clear cut as one would suggest. Then I spoke to some Ukrainians who said to me that they actually wanted to be part of the European Union, and so I would lead the conversation towards the IMF. And is joining the European Union, is that freedom or is that just another form of tyranny? But anyway, I'll hand over to you.
Well, this is a very complex situation. First of all, you are correct, and the view of the British are correct, who view that Russia is indeed doing a stealth invasion of Ukraine. Now, to understand why and what their purpose is, vis-a-vis the globalists and what they are doing, we have to go back a little bit further to the fall of the Soviet Union. It's very important to understand that this was a carefully crafted deception, that it never was a spontaneous fall of the Soviet Union because of economic collapse.
Hang on, Joseph. So you're saying the fall of the Berlin Wall, the crash of the communist state was a pre-designed event?
That's correct, by the communists. In the book, Antonin Golitsyn, New Lies for Old, projected this in the 1980s, said they're planning on doing a fall. They had done it during Lenin's period too, in order to get aid and trade from the West. And the Russians, the Soviets could not keep up with American technology, even though they were stealing significant amounts of it, even though Henry Kissinger, as a globalist in the Nixon administration, had given to the Russians the miniature ball-bearing technology, allowing them to do multiple independent warheads on their missiles. Heretofore, they could only do one warhead. Now they can do multiple independent reentry vehicles, which are called MIRV warheads, and we gave them the technology. We gave Russia the original nuclear material to explode their first atomic bomb. That was after World War II. Why would we do that?
That's right. Why?
Well, the globalist intent is to create two huge enemies that will eventually lead to another world war. They've used war, World War I, for example, to take down the Tsar, to take down the British monarchy. They weren't going along with globalist financial control, and they needed a war to eliminate those two countries. The globalists in Britain and the United States financed Bolshevism. Why would capitalists finance Bolshevism? And that's because it's out of conflict that they can rearrange governments and make it not look like they are doing it. So they finance the Bolsheviks to do it. They've used communism to break down the world order. Then the globalists come to the rescue. You know, we're removing communism from you, but in fact, we're establishing another type of control. It appears that you're still free. They tell you that you're free, but you're still locked into a control system. Much of what the IMF and the World Bank has been doing in handing out money is to get control over countries by getting them into debt. Now, these are all bankrupt socialist countries anyway, all over Latin America and Africa. And they simply get into the clutches of the globalist financial controllers by taking on more debt. Now, while it is true that some of the austerity measures which the IMF requires are correct, those are meant really to create conflict. In other words, you take a socialist country and you say, all right, you've got to stop giving up so many benefits, you've got to stop hiring everybody into the national bureaucracy, as in Greece, and everybody starts to rebel. And it creates conflict. It creates these riots and things. And out of those riots, they can manipulate government. So their true purpose is not to give people correct economic advice, even though austerity is correct. The purpose is to create conflict so that they can manipulate governments and who replaces who. Now, in Ukraine, going back to the phony fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviets moved in millions of Russians into various countries prior to the fall. Now, going back to the evidence, first of all, for the fall, Erich Honecker, where the fall began in the Leipzig riots of the University of Germany in Leipzig, said on his deathbed in Chile, he said that Moscow gave him orders to let the Leipzig students riot. They gave him orders to tear down the Berlin Wall. They also gave Ceausescu of Romania orders to step down, and he refused, and so he was killed. And of course, they set up in the phony fall, or prior to the phony fall, several people years in advance, decades in advance, to set the mode that we are anti-communist, that we are pro-liberty. Lech Walesa in Poland, we now know, was a communist agent all during the years that he was running Solidarity. Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, the famous pro-Western poet, we now know through the uncovering of the archives, was a Soviet agent. So you see, they set up, even in Romania, the successor Iliescu of Ceausescu quit the Communist Party 2 years prior to set him up as an anti-communist. But in fact, everybody there laughed when they said that he's pro-Western. They knew his communist background. And so we have had, after the fall of the Soviet Union, legitimate anti-communists try to come to power. There was a president in Poland that was killed in a plane crash who was legitimately pro-European, and he was taken out in that plane crash. The same thing in Belarus. You know, there were true freedom movements, and then you had the pro-Moscow fronts come in. Now, Ukraine, one of the things in all of the former Soviet states that is so important to understand is that none of those nations ever removed the old corrupt communist bureaucracy. And that's why corruption reigns in every one of these post-Soviet states, including Ukraine. Tymoshenko came in, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko, as an anti-communist, anti-Moscow, pro-Ukraine, but she was a fraud. The first thing she did was get elected, was to go visit Putin in Moscow, and she established relationships. She often talked with Putin on things. She never removed any of the communist bureaucracy, and that was the old corruption system. You had to have bribes and pay bribes in order to get what you wanted in a communist regime if you were part of the nomenclatura or the elite. The same thing still happens in Ukraine and all over the former Soviet states.
Joel, why is Ukraine such an important area? If we link it back to Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard in his book, I think that's the correct title, isn't it, for his book?
Yes.
Because he speaks about Eurasia being the central focus for the next power struggle in that book.
Well, first, Ukraine has always been the breadbasket of the Soviet system. It produces a tremendous amount of grain. It also had a fair amount of industrial capacity. Many of the missiles in the Soviet Union were built in Ukraine. It has the warm water port, of course, which is very, very important, which has just been lost in Crimea, but it's still got other warm water ports on the sea as well. So Ukraine is key towards Russia being able to project power, just like the Baltic states are key towards keeping the Baltic Sea, another warm water port, open for the Russians. And so what I was saying is they moved in millions of Russians into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They moved them into Belarus. They moved them into Ukraine. In other words, all of the so-called ethnic Russians or Russian people in Ukraine were moved in there. They weren't the original Ukrainians. And so they did that on purpose so that the Russians, when they would begin to undo the phony fall of the Soviet Union, reestablish Soviet power, they would have an excuse to create conflict. Just as Hitler used the Germans, ethnic Germans in Poland and in Czechoslovakia to justify invasions there, as well as into Austria. So this is a long-term Hegelian strategy of moving people in to create conflict. Now,
Hegelian Dialectic, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the Russians have always intended to reestablish the Soviet Union. That is why I believe that they have false pro-Western leaders in every one of the pro-Soviet, post-Soviet states.
But I remember you having an argument a discussion with Alex Jones about this, because Victoria Nuland, has been released about her F the EU comments and how they wanted to place specific people within specific jobs within the Ukrainian government. I mean, that's common knowledge.
That's right. Now, I've read through the transcript of the Victoria Nuland discussion, and this really is not as much as a telling discussion as, the CIA, the State Department discuss this about almost every country. They're always trying to influence elections. This does not mean that there's absolute control. The reason this is complex is that Russia itself is the master of putting in false leaders into position in countries that play an anti-Russian role, and they control them. Look at the fall of the Soviet Union in Russia itself. The Russian Communist Party is still ruling Russia, even though it has an open Communist Party that only has about 20% support.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you will hear people in the Moscow, still in the Kremlin, still talking about, well, the party has directed this, the party does that. Now, you go back to Soviet history, whenever people mention the party, they're not talking about United Russia, Putin's party. They're talking about the old Communist Party, the party. And it's still used today in the Kremlin. The party says we need to do this. Now, so there's an above-ground Communist Party with limited, mostly for the old people who long for the old Soviet breadline days where at least they had security. But the true underground Communist Party still controls Russia. They still control Putin. No single leader is running the show. Obama is not running the show in America. There's a cadre of globalists behind him that calls the shots. One of the most telling proofs of that was Obama's national security advisor in 2009, James Jones, speaking at the Munich Security Conference. And they had just given an award to Henry Kissinger the previous day, and when he got up to give his speech, he began with these remarks. At the National Security Council, we have a hierarchy. We get our daily marching orders from Henry Kissinger and Associates, passed down through Brent Scowcroft and Sandy Berger. That was an admission of conspiracy. Henry Kissinger has no legal right to be given orders, let alone even suggestions, suggestions, let alone orders.
Where does Kissinger get his authority, and Brzezinski, etc.?
These are globalists, and this is the best kept secret in the world of who's actually running the show at the very top. These people, we know that David Rockefeller is one of those people. There's always a Rothschild involved in that from the British side. We know that the City of London, that is the small city within London, has been the center of financial control over Europe. They lost that financial control to the United States after Bretton Woods and the dollar became dominant. But they still exercise this joint political control with American people who are involved in globalism. And that's the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, Aspen Institute, the Bilderberg Group. None of these are actually the controlling organizations. They're merely the organizations that attract a great many of the powerful and wealthy, and where they get oriented in globalist policies. They vet them to see if they are amenable to those things, if they are sufficiently unprincipled to climb the ladder of control. You have to be unprincipled. They rely on having dirt on people. They rely on, that's part of what NSA spying is about. You collect the indiscretions and the bad things that people have done, and you use it to control them if necessary throughout life. But going back to Ukraine in the fall of the Soviet Union, it's very important to understand that Russia has always intended to reconstitute the Soviet Union after a sufficient period of time where the West has given them sufficient money and aid and trade. For example, it's Western European and American oil companies that built the Russian oil power into what it is. I mean, they're the ones who developed all the infrastructure. They're still there today, despite the sanctions. They have not been required to call out. The sanctions are token sanctions. Now, the most important thing, going back to the Ukraine specifically, to prove my point about Russian control of the opposition, is my proof that the Ukrainian coup was not a pro-Western coup, was actually engineered by Russia itself to appear to be pro-Russian. The proof of this is this. In February of 2014, during the coup, on Thursday, when the so-called opposition leaders met with Yanukovych and his team to create a resolution to the Maidan protests, which were turning violent because of snipers. Now, there's also, of course, going back to the Estonian foreign minister talking to the EU, Ashton.
That's right,
Ashton.
Yeah.
Where they appear to talk about the fact that, the snipers were really not Russian, but they were pro-opposition.
Yeah.
But in fact, he got that information, the Estonian foreign minister, from a Russian in there. Now, in fact, there was agent provocateur snipers that were killing on both sides. Now, we don't know who they belong to, but we know that they belong to whoever was controlling the outcome of the phony coup, and that's why I still say these were pro-Russian snipers, and I'll explain why. The point is that the Maidan protesters did not trust those that were supposedly representing them at the talks. These were like Svoboda and the Freedom Party and other controlled opposition. And I'll get into what's behind Svoboda in a minute. But the point is, when they came out with this agreement that Yanukovych was going to stay in power, but they would give them certain additional powers under the Constitution, certain reforms, which had already been betrayed. Those reforms had been voted on before, and the Party of Regions in the Rada, or the Parliament of Ukraine, had failed to implement those reforms. And so the protest says, hey, this is not new things. We aren't interested in this deal. We reject the deal. And so all of a sudden a crisis. The deal had been rejected by the protesters in the street. They weren't going to go home. And so on Friday, the Berkut, the riot police in Ukraine, went back to their barracks. They stopped manning the barricades. They stopped opposing the opposition. They even left the National Palace. They left all of the national buildings of the government wide open. And so the protesters could suddenly walk through all the national, but there were no guards. And they were allowed to win. And then on Saturday, the Party of Regions in Ukraine voted to oust Yanukovych, their leader. Now, for you in British terms, this would be as if the National or the Independent Party, who has been trying to gain, control of elections, were protesting in the streets of London for months, burning tires. And all of a sudden, all of the guards on a Friday of Buckingham Palace left and went back to the barracks and let the protesters run through Buckingham Palace and had the run of the Parliament. All the guards went home. And then on Saturday, it would be as if the ruling Labour Party or the Conservative Party voted to oust their own prime minister. Now, how believable would that be? People would say, wait a minute, how believable is that? Who gave the orders to the guards at Buckingham Palace to go home? It couldn't have been the protesters. It had to be the government. And that's the same thing that I say. No one virtually in this world has ever been able to counter my two arguments. Who gave the Berkut the orders to go back to the barracks? Was it the opposition? Could they have done it? Absolutely impossible. Who gave the orders to the Party of Region to oust and unelect and tell their own leader, Yanukovych, to flee? Now, he claimed he was fleeing because that there were, armed people. Well, the opposition had a few token weapons, but the snipers had professional weapons. And if they were after Yanukovych, it's because essentially the powers that be told him, get out of town or we're going to kill you, but it wasn't the opposition. So what I'm saying is, you look at the opposition leaders, you look at Yatsenyuk, here's a person who has a very establishment background. I can tell you this, that during the administration of Prime Minister Yanukovych, he never would have allowed him to be head of the National Bank of Ukraine if he weren't an insider. And so suddenly he becomes in the opposition, and he becomes very, very pro-Western. Well, he's actually maintained a fairly pro-Western, but I'll tell you, this is part of the opposition. You don't allow people to control the major financial issues unless you're really working for the other side. Same thing with Yulia Tymoshenko. How does she get all the shares of Gazprom and these other insider relationships and become wealthy? Well, you do that because you're really an insider, even though you're playing an opposition role. So Poroshenko is an oligarch. You don't become wealthy in the post-Soviet states unless you have insider connections. All of the wealthy in Russia became wealthy through the notorious trading shares for equity. The State National Bank gave them the money to buy Gazprom. They gave them the money to buy Yukos oil. They gave them the money. You see, how did you get money in those days if you weren't capitalists?
John, why would the Russians and Putin and the party want the rise of fascism in Ukraine? Because that's what we're seeing, is it not? We are seeing.
Because here's what you do: when you control the opposition, the pro-Western opposition, then you proceed to sabotage everything you do in the name of the pro-Western government. You sabotage the war by not coming to the rescue of Ukrainian troops who are besieged by the pro-Russian insurgents, so to speak. Look at the Donetsk airport fiasco. Went on for some 3 months. You can't tell me that the Ukrainian army couldn't have come in and broken that siege of the airport and rescued those Ukrainian special forces that were holding the 3rd floor of the terminal. It didn't take 3 months. You could have done it, but you just let it go on. You let them lose. You can't tell me that the Ukrainians, and look at Poroshenko, when he was vying for the election, he claimed, I'm going to allow Russian as a second language and to pacify the Russian people in the eastern Ukraine. And as soon as he got elected, he reneged on that. Now, if you're trying to win hearts and minds of people in eastern Ukraine, you don't betray your promises to that. And what would have cost him?
Oh, come on, every politician in the name of politics goes against everything they state prior to election, no? I mean, Barak Obama is a fantastic example.
No, there's a difference between doing things for political advantage going against your promises. I mean, in America, they promise the most conservative things when they're running, and as soon as they get elected, they go against those because to the establishment. But in Russia, to send in mercenaries to kill a lot of civilians only in the name of the Kiev government only gets you a bad reputation. And if you were really trying to win hearts and minds and say you wouldn't do these things, they were unnecessary. It was unnecessary. People are going to speak Russian in Eastern Ukraine anyway. So why is it necessary to make it illegal? You're only antagonizing people in the name of the West.
But John, why are we seeing Western mercenary soldiers in Ukrainian outfits and so on and so forth?
Okay, let's talk about that because there have been a few videos surfaced. There are a few special forces, and most of the ones that have surfaced have been British accents. So your own government in England is in fact providing special forces. But the British special forces are black operations that have been really running a lot of things in line with the US CIA. They really are joined very, very closely. Britain and the United States, they have this special relationship. And more so because this is an Anglo-American globalist conspiracy. They are tied together. For example, in Syria, with ISIS, which is a creation of US and British special operations, using Israeli agents. Israel has the most sophisticated trained Arabs from their own people. They have a lot of Arabs in Israel that they brought into their special operations. They have the most success in infiltrating Iraq, Iran, Jordan. Every single Arab country has been infiltrated by Israeli agents in order to find out what they're doing and to create agent provocateurs. They're running a great many of the Syrian rebels, if not all of the leadership, and basically came in because, and the story of Syria is very, very important, Israel has been tasked by the globalists since 2004 to attack Iran and remove it as a threat in the Middle East. And the reason it's a threat is Iran is the only Muslim country that is on the verge of manufacturing their own complete set of weapons technology, from missiles to tanks to aircraft to drones to missiles and nuclear weapons.
But isn't it also true that Iran print their own currency and they own their own banks and financial systems? Isn't that also true?
Well, sure. Every country has their own control of the banks, but that doesn't give them power necessarily. I do not buy into the argument that Iran was targeted because they're going off the dollar, or Iraq was targeted because they're going off the dollar. Those were superficial excuses. There's a real globalist reason for doing things the way that the globalists do. For example, in the war against Serbia, when the US military and NATO forces went into bomb, they bombed infrastructure. They didn't bomb military targets. They were purposely trying to poison the Slavic people against the West. It was the CIA, for example, that went into Albania and took the Kosovarians that were in exile there, trained them to come in, and it was the Kosovar leaders that actually drove out the Kosovo people from Kosovo. It's their leaders came in and threatened them, "We're going to kill you if you don't get your people out." And so it was the West that created these long convoys to blame it on Syria. They shot up a lot of people and dressed them in Serbian, or dressed them in Kosovarian uniforms and blame it on Syria. And then they antagonized the Serbian people by hitting infrastructure, radio and television stations, electrical power plants, dams and bridges. Why are you going to hit bridges? There's no invading army heading towards Kosovo. You're just inconvenient. So, after the phony fall of the Soviet Union, Americans and Europeans were very popular in Russia. Anything of the West, from religion to products, were then popular. But after we started bombing Serbia, suddenly there was a wave of anti-American and anti-European feeling in Russia. We helped poison the Russian people against the West. And that's part of the reason to understand Victoria Nuland and the influence in Ukraine. is that the globalists wanting to give Putin an excuse to come back to power, give Putin an excuse to have it, does this intervention. But Victoria Nuland was lying when she said that we poured $5 billion into the Ukraine. She was speaking to a Ukrainian group, and she was bragging about how much influence we've had. But in fact, the entire budget in Eastern Europe for all of the former Soviet states, in terms of scholarships, and was $5 billion. It was incorrect that $5 billion went to Ukraine. And even of all the money that the U.S. gives to these organizations, most of them go to foundations in the West that are using money for scholarships and other things. These are not going for weapons transfer, and they're not going directly into Ukraine. You couldn't hide $5 billion in the Ukrainian economy. It'd be very obvious where it was going.
So, Joel, what's the end game? Why Iraq? Why the tensions in Syria, in Ukraine? Online there's a conversation about the letter from Albert Pike that sets out the 3 world wars. We've had 2, and we're running up to the 3rd. That's the online conversation. Whether that's real or not, I don't know. Apparently that letter was in the British Museum for some point and has been removed. Again, I have never seen the letter itself. But why all the tension? Why would the West encourage Putin and the party to encroach in other people's territories, etc.?
Well, this goes back to my general theory about what the ultimate end game for the globalist is. The end game is to have a global government that they control, where people still are told that they're free, but it's a very controlled democracy, is the kind that we're seeing happening, where you have to have permission for everything. And you can't get Western people into that without a lot of resistance. You can't go into it by boiling the frog slowly. Oh, yes, you can do a certain amount, get them to a certain degree accustomed to more control, but eventually they start to resist. Look at the rise of the ultranationalist parties in Europe and in the UK against the EU. They won the most votes in the European Parliament in the last election, the National Front, the Independent Party. Nigel Farage, he's really coming up strong because there's this hatred of control. That's why the Western globalists know we give them another war to force them into control in the name of security. Now, the war on terror was all about that, giving up essential freedoms for security, and we know that we haven't got security because of that, because our governments, British black operations, US black operations, are fomenting these terror wars. They created ISIS as an excuse to get back into Syria, which is another story. But ultimately, they want a major world war, and it's going to be a nuclear world war against the West. And I have the evidence that shows that our government in the United States is intending, and the British government, to absorb a nuclear first strike on our missile and nuclear submarine forces. In order to create a massive panic among the West, how do we defend ourselves now? Now, this is not a nuclear strike against American and British cities. They know, the globalists know, that the Russians and Chinese want to run their own version of the New World Order. They've always intended to attack the West. That's the purpose of Russia faking their own demise in order to gain economic power and for military rebuilding, which they're doing in spades while the U.S. is disarming. And China, that's why they have been playing this game of semi-capitalism. While they gain a tremendous amount of income and power and technology, they require that every company coming into Japan yield up their technology to them. Eventually, Russia and China intend to attack one another. They are only temporarily aligned in order to take down the West. But for now, the West is the target, and the West wants to be the target. Now, this is inconceivable for most people in the West. Why would the Western conspirators actually induce a nuclear strike on their nations when that's the center of their power? Aren't they putting themselves at risk? Not necessarily. They, first of all, know that Russia and China don't intend to destroy infrastructure. They want to preserve it so that they can blackmail. They want to hit military targets only. The U.S. have spies in Russia. They have spies in China. They know that they only intend to hit military targets to take down the West's ability to defend itself. And then they blackmail the West into submission. That's the Soviet and the Russian plan. But the globalists intend to absorb that nuclear first strike. And I can prove that because of what is called Presidential Decision Directive 60. It's a secret presidential decision directive, which we have the essence leaked to us by the people who wrote it, who were disarmament freaks in the United States. And they said PDD 60 says to our nuclear forces to not depend on launch on warning, but to prepare to absorb a nuclear first strike and then retaliate afterward. And General Butch Neal, who saw the order, said, retaliate with what? Once you've absorbed a nuclear first strike, you got all your missiles are taken out, 50% of your submarines, because the United States voluntarily and suicidally agreed to keep 50% of their submarines in port at any one time to make them easier for the Russians to target, to make the Russians feel comfortable that we're not threatening them. I mean, it's suicide. Without launch on warning, and what that means is that when our satellites detect a Russian and Chinese launch, we launch our missiles and target them on what is necessary over there so that their missiles end up hitting empty silos. So in a launch on warning scenario, those that launch second win the war. But our government, because nobody can launch any missiles without the codes from our president, it's called the nuclear suitcase, has all the codes, military aid travels wherever he goes. He's not going to give the codes to the nuclear forces. They're going to absorb a nuclear first strike, and the same thing in Britain as well. And then our leaders come out of their bunkers, and they're building bunkers not because of terrorism, because they know this strike is coming. These are deep underground bunkers. They come out of their bunkers and say, we didn't know about this. The Russians and Chinese have deceived us. And now that the American military is destroyed, we have no choice but to band together in a Western global government to protect ourselves. And it's got to be militarized. We've got to have taxing power. We've got to have military power. And I believe that they have reserved secret weapon systems that they are developing, not to defend against that initial strike, but they'll bring those secret weapons systems out to stop any further nuclear attacks from occurring. When they reject the blackmail and say, we're going to fight, and they'll gin up this marvelous patriotic World War III in hearkening back to World War II, the last great generation, the last great war, and they'll say, let's fight. And I think the formation of the new European army is the core of what will become that. It can only survive, of course, if they bring out what I think they have, space-based weapon systems, special beam weapons, and other things that they developed that they could have used to defend us that they did not. But they'll bring them out to give us breathing time while they reconstitute a global army. And that's how we get into a global government.
Joel, is it fair to suggest that right at the top of the political structure, a deal has already been agreed between the various parties, and they're rolling out a sort of theatre for the rest of the world, or is that just web speak?
I think that's just web speak. Many people, naive conspiracy believe that the globalists actually control Russia because Rothschilds are involved in Yukos oil and Rothschild. But you've got to remember, this involvement, as well as helping out the Chinese, and the U.S. gets a lot of technology to the Chinese through the Israelis. The Israelis are allowed to sell weapons technologies, and a lot of that's American technology. So the U.S. is kind of hands-free. But you must not misinterpret helping Russia build itself as an enemy as control. In fact, we don't find in the Verona transcripts any indication of this kind of direct collusion between the Russians. Yes, they accepted whatever aid, but they viewed the Western people as stupid, as naive. Look at they're giving us, the rope that we're going to use to hang them. They can't understand. Kissinger's going to give us the ball-bearing technology. Man, how can they be this stupid knowing that we're going to use it against them? You see, if you wouldn't see those kinds of conversations if they were in fact in knowing collusion. It's a one-way street. The globalist helping the Russians, helping the Chinese, protecting them. Our intelligence services are never able to whisper a word about Russian cheating because our government says we're not going to attack Russia. We're going to be friends with Russia, even though Russia is cheating and has been cheating on all the nuclear treaties. We just took all 3 warheads off of our remaining 450 Minuteman missiles and turned them into single warhead missiles, because we agreed to a treaty that the Russians long ago abandoned. So why are we continuing to disarm? Because the West knows that the Russians and Chinese are still very much afraid to attack the West. They know some secret weapon systems are being built. They're stealing as much technology. They're building as many weapons of mass. But how much is enough to overcome this technological superiority of the West? They're afraid. So the U.S. has to keep bending over backwards to show weakness, to attract this strike.
Okay.
They don't control this strike. And that's part of the reason in Ukraine why the United States sanctions are token. They're giving enough sanctions, they're doing enough intervention in Ukraine to give Putin an excuse to be before the Russians and people and decry the West, to decry NATO as interfering in Russian sovereignty. But in fact, he has his own agenda, and that agenda is to take back all of the former Soviet states. I'll tell you, they won't take back all of Ukraine. They'll take back probably at least half of it so that they control the entire Black Sea coast as well as Crimea. And then they'll start to concentrate on the Baltics. And the Baltics know it's coming. If you've ever been to the Baltics, there's tremendous conflict between the millions of Russians in there and the majority Baltic people. And that's why Lithuania says, we've got to prepare for war. We know it's coming. We know the Russians are not going to be satisfied with the Kaliningrad enclave, which think of this, why, when the West negotiated this particular treaty with Russia about the fall of the Soviet Union, why would they agree to give them Kaliningrad and not require to let them? Because they knew the Russians needed a pocket of militarization to prepare for the strike of the West right on the border of Poland. And that's what Kaliningrad is. And they have Iskander rockets and other things in there, which are offensive rockets, not defensive rockets. Well, Lithuania knows that Russia's going to take a corridor, a land corridor, into Kaliningrad through its property. And Poland is going to be the target as well of that. Why did we agree, for example, that we wouldn't bring any of the former Soviet states into NATO, knowing that we would break that agreement? Because that would give Putin an excuse to say, look, the West is antagonizing, the West is encroaching on what they promised. And so now the US and NATO is up to a 90% unpopularity rating in Russia. And we have done that. We have created the image of the US as the bully of the world. And part of the reason for intervening in all of these countries in Iraq is to present this image of the bully, to hand Russia and China the excuse that somebody has to take down the bully of the world. And that is what they will do. They'll claim to be taking down the bully of the world in this first strike.
So this is a deliberate march towards major global conflict, is that correct?
That's right. But the US, the globalists, don't want it to make it look like their fault. They've got to make it look like this was, and it is. They know that the Russians intend to strike eventually. That's what they're building all these weapons for. Anybody who sits there listening to this video, shaking their head and say, oh, the Russians and Chinese would never do this. They have always intended to do this. And the US knows it. But they've been taking years to do it. And that's why the US has to continue to bend over backwards and to be permissive with sanctions. And I mean, the sanctions are phony. What do you do when you sanction the bank accounts of the top advisors? You don't stop anything from happening in Russia. The US is still not requiring that there are US and British oil companies remove themselves from Russia. They're still importing Russian oil. What kind of sanction is that?
Indeed. So what can the people of Ukraine expect in the next? I think your prediction for war is 20,000 onwards, 2020 onwards, perhaps.
Yes, and I don't say a specific, I just have said I don't think the Russians and Chinese will be ready before the beginning of the next decade because their top-of-the-line weapon systems in any numbers are not expected to come online until the beginning of the decade. And they're very open about that. And they are building new submarines, missiles, hypersonic missiles, anti-satellite weapons. It takes a while to build enough of that, though, where you can take on the West. So I think we do have time. And by the way, nobody's laughing now about my prediction of war. In fact, we've got too many people out there in the net predicting that Ukraine's going to end up in World War III, and I don't believe so. Russia is specifically maintaining a stealth invasion. If he wanted to provoke a war with the West, he would do an open invasion. He's taking it slow. And that means this is as long as slow, but he hasn't even begun to work on the Baltics.
Right.
And you're going to see all of those nations and inroads so that eventually when Russia's ready to strike, they will have troops surrounding all of the former Soviet, ready to come in because there will be conflict in those former Soviet states justifying the Russian presence on the border. But it will still start with a nuclear preemptive strike on US and British nuclear forces. And so my message to people in the Ukraine is don't be deceived by this ostensive pro-Western government. It is being run by Russia. They are false opposition. Look at Svoboda. There is no such thing in Europe, the United States, Britain, or anyone else as a neo-Nazi party that is not run by Western intelligence. Nobody promotes themselves in the name of nationalism as Nazis unless they are paid and promoted by black operations to do so. It's a totally discredited philosophy. The skinheads and other things. I mean, yes, there are radicals that you can recruit, but you look at the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, they're no longer Southerners. They have a Northern accent. They wear their hoods. These are government operations. There is no sentiment for the Ku Klux Klan, even in the South nowadays. But government promotes these things in order to have an excuse to come and attack the right wing, to make them look bad, to make the National Front look bad, to make the independent party in Britain look bad.
So are you saying the puppet government in Ukraine is Western-backed or it's Russian-backed?
It's Russian-controlled. Okay. It's Western-backed because the Western governments know that the Russians pulled this phony fall and they didn't blow the whistle on them. And they're continuing to play as if it's true. And so yes, they are supporting, yes, they are trying to support Svoboda, but it's because they know that eventually that discredits the West. All of the Western parties in Ukraine are discrediting the West by antagonizing the East, by sabotaging the war. The generals in Ukraine are beside themselves because they know that Kiev is sabotaging the war and not letting them win. And they're hiring all these thugs to become in the National Guard. Let's talk about U.S. intervention. U.S. and British troops in Ukraine, right? Well, hardly. They're supposedly training. Well, the only people who are in there doing any fighting, and I don't think they're really doing any fighting as well as they're providing the front line of information as spies, and those are the British Special Forces they've sent in to work with at the front lines. That's why they don't want you on camera, because they're not supposed to be there. I don't know how many. This is a top secret, but I'll tell you this, the 300 U.S. troops in there don't speak Ukrainian. How much training are you going to do in there? This is tokenism. They are not at the front lines. They're way, way back from there in Western Ukraine, and so are the British 75 troops going in there. If you really want to train Ukraine troops and things, you bring Ukrainians to the West and you train them on the systems, let them go back and train their own people. You don't send non-Ukrainian speakers, common soldiers into Ukraine to so called be training. This is just tokenism. Now there will be some training, but it won't be effective.
Ukraine itself as a country is huge, isn't it? It's a huge country. So the wars in the east and if you're in the West and you're closer to Italy than you are to the war. So there's a huge distance between it. And when I've spoken to people on the ground in Ukraine, they don't even notice that there's a war going on, actually.
That's right.
Right. So and it's been blown into this huge issue by the Western,
it is a real issue. It is a Russian stealth invasion, and a lot of the people claim on the left, on the people on the left, Putin is the victim, you see. Putin is just defending national interest. Baloney. Putin is part of the Soviet deception, and he is reconstituting the Soviet Union. And he's loving the fact that the West is letting it get him. And the people on the West say, well, look, if the U.S. claims that the Russians are involved and they're sending it, show us the satellite photos. The U.S. could do that. And they aren't, because they're protecting Russia from the obvious. You've got to remember that you will never see any sufficient Western, NATO, or U.S. intervention in Ukraine to create an actual conflict between Western and Russian troops. Both are playing a game for their own reasons. U.S. intervening enough, NATO intervening enough to give Putin an excuse to say the West is attacking our national interest, but not doing enough to actually provoke a war because they know Putin isn't ready yet. This is going to go on for a few years. It's going to put people to sleep. Eventually, it's going to become ho-hum. But my warning is, and if you see this video 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you'll see I was right, that eventually this war comes and the West is viewed as the victim, but in fact, they know that it's coming, they want it to come, and we're going to get a global government with tyrannical powers in response.
Because it's the same MO every time. If you look at the truth about the Second World War and the First World War, then the consolidation of power post each war and the preemptive elements that led up to each war, and because the history is written by the winners of the war,
right.
Of course. And I studied history because of course I find history fascinating. But it's so if we are moving towards war, what's going to happen to Europe? What's going to happen to the North Europe, to England, to the southern coastline of Europe? What's your prediction?
Let me just comment before I talk about how to prepare for this, because you have to prepare. It's coming. Even though the same MO has occurred of deception, it's gotten much more sophisticated, especially in the power of these people to imitate the right, to imitate the true position, to falsify the opposition. This has become extremely sophisticated. Given that, and my prediction that this war is coming, it's going to hit Europe square in the face because Russia is a major threat. I think there will be cross-border invasion all across the former Soviet states. And they could be, at the borders of Germany and Austria, within probably a week. Especially because NATO is a very, very shallow shield, high-tech army, just like the U.S., but very shallow. There's not a lot of depth in terms of conventional weapons. I can guarantee that the Russians have to take Finland, Sweden, as well as the Baltics and Norway, to preserve their ability to get out from the Baltic Sea from their northern fleet. All right. So you're going to at least see the southern populated areas of Sweden, Finland, near the coast, taken over in a matter of weeks with special shock forces. As traditionally in most wars, Spain has been the safest place from the war because it's the further distance from the front in all of the previous wars. And anytime anyone wanted to escape the war, they go through Spain. And so you've wisely chosen to be in Spain, but ultimately, and I don't think the Russians are going to win this war. In fact, I think ultimately the U.S. will negotiate, or the U.S. and Britain will negotiate a deal with China to betray Russia, just as they negotiated with Stalin to betray Hitler after his pact, the Stalin-Ribbentrop Pact. And so Russia can't win if it's got a two-front war with the huge Chinese dragon on the east and the West. And I think Russia will be eliminated in World War III. The West will win, but because China would become the new Cold War enemy and very, very powerful, the globalists will say, well, we can't go back to individual national sovereignty. We have to protect ourselves. And once again, for security, we're going to have to keep this global army together. And I think that's why you don't lose you lose your freedom. And there will be gun control, there will be gun confiscation after the war, during the war, especially in the United States. And I don't think you can get to that politically until a war comes. A war justifies all these things. Europe is already disarmed, and so it's not difficult. But remember, when you don't have arms, you have no protection against the ultimate tyranny that comes. And so my advice is you have to prepare to survive this war. The basic elements of preparing is strategic relocation. If you are living near the front areas, you've got to get back towards the areas like Spain, where you've got distance. Distance gives you the ability to maneuver and to get off the continent if that is possible. If you're in the North countries, the Scandinavia, you need to prepare to go further north to get into the areas away from the population center, even if it's just a retreat, even if it's just a recreation mountain cabin in an area, and the more rural, the better. And you need to stockpile several things. You need to stockpile food. There will be famine in this next war. You need to stockpile some weapons and ammunition, even if they have to be purchased illegally. You may laugh, and those of you who just eschew any concept of self-defense will wish you had them. When you look at the Polish resistance, in the Jewish ghettos, for example, in the Warsaw resistance, it's just a handful of weapons that people had secreted away became the ultimate defense that allowed them to take weapons from their aggressors by shooting soldiers and getting automatic weapons. You've got to start with something. You must have some weapons. I'm not suggesting that you kill innocent people because they're hungry. I'm suggesting these are used for defense and to get more weapons when you decide to mount a resistance, if necessary. But more than anything else, you need to prepare in advance to have secret hiding places. Freedom requires that you be free from the lockup, from the searches, from, it was the Jews of World War II that were locked up. And you had to have places to hide the Jews if you wanted to protect them. But in World War III, it's the people that believe in conspiracy, the liberty dissidents that are going to be the targets of World War III, not the Jews. So you must prepare places to hide like-minded people who are on the run from authorities. And I cannot emphasize that it takes preparation in advance to do that. Because when war comes, you won't be able to get building materials. And you must learn to do things yourself. There's only one way to keep from being discovered when you are fighting against government in a resistance. You've got to do it yourself. You need the skills to construct, to repair things, and to maneuver just for survival.
Joel, do you expect when this comes, a number of things, the global economy to shut down? So we return to local economy. And do you also expect parents to be aware that conscription will be adopted throughout Europe? Is that correct?
Yes, that's very wise. There will be famine. There will be, the economy shuts down immediately. It becomes a wartime economy. Everything is rationed and controlled. And there will be massive conscription. And it's very sad to say that if you believe the propaganda that your government will protect the troops, it's not true. The mere fact that PDD-60 is alive, if the U.S. troops are going to be at risk of being nuked, and the government knows it, they've got bunkers, but they are not preparing bunkers for the troops. And so I am, because it now becomes, while they will say this is a war of patriotism, this is a war of liberty, it's not a war of liberty, it's a war that will ultimately end up in securing the powers to the global government. And so there's a legitimate right to resist of this. There's a right to evade conscription. There's a right to prepare on the other side of this to still fight for our liberty.
How young will the kids be Will it be 17 up, or how does conscription work?
Well, I think it will begin, and depending on how bad the war goes, it will begin, 18-year-olds and up. They like to pick the young, single, unmarried people that get the least resistance.
Yep.
And depending on how bad the war, it could go clear up to 30 in terms of that. But
men and
it's
women?
very, pardon?
Both boys and girls?
Yes, there's going to be subscription for women too. And they'll be put into combat. It's going to be very, very bad, as it is in the United States military, wherever they have mixed women in units. The amount of rape that occurs in the military is epidemic. You can imagine what it would be in wartime. Do not, I repeat, do not send your girls to join the war, no matter how patriotic it is sold to you. It's a death trap.
Okay, so when people watch this or there's conversations post this interview, generally speaking, conspiracy comes up and we're not going to war. What would you say to the people who say you're a conspiracy theorist?
Well, the media has long since made this a target of denigration. You denigrate anyone who dares to believe. But, conspiracy has existed since the beginning of the world. Since Cain conspired to kill Abel, to get his economic gain, there's been conspiracy. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is a great secret, and it isn't that everybody involved in a conspiracy has to know what the whole end game, who's involved, that would get exposed. The conspiracy uses a multiple tiered level of insidership. Only those at the very top know who the very top is. There's a need to know, and they use national security to hide these illegal acts and to cover up. But the conspiracy is widespread, the control system. Most of it is run by hiring predictable people who are not opposed to control systems, that like a considerable amount of socialism. You don't have to tell them there's a conspiracy. They'll do what you point them to do because they've got a proclivity for that. Yeah. You do use threats occasionally. You get too close, you say, hey, there's a matter of national security, you don't ask. If they push, you start to say, what happened to Vince Foster? What happened to this guy, Ron Brown, who got a bullet in his head in an airplane crash? You just point out to people that you can be taken down. This is very dangerous. And that's how a conspiracy operates. It's very large, and it crosses a lot of political parties. And that doesn't mean that everyone who is controlled knows about the conspiracy. Many times they're controlled because they have dirt on them, and they threaten to expose them. Many of our politicians are corrupt and have these problems. So I am a believer that there is a massive conspiracy to take away liberty. It's very sophisticated. I'll stand by it. I have the proof. If you give me enough time, just like I quoted the proof about General James Jones' statement in Munich in 2009. It's an absolute proof of conspiracy. He didn't say we get daily suggestions from Henry Kissinger. We get our daily marching orders. He talked about we have a hierarchy, and Henry Kissinger is at the top of that hierarchy as far as we're concerned. Now, that's a non-government official giving orders to the National Security Council every day of the year. Now, that's conspiracy. It's illegal. And he has openly admitted, and the conspiracy is so confident. You can read that speech on the Council on Foreign Relations website.
That's right.
Just Google James Jones. It's still there. Even though it's a proof of conspiracy, they are confident you can't stop us now. So they don't take it down. They don't edit it. It's there for the world to see.
Joel, listen, thank you very, very much for your time. How do people get in contact with you, sir?
Well, I think if people are concerned about what I say, they should subscribe to my weekly news analysis service called the World Affairs Brief. It's a very modest subscription of $48 a year. It's by email, so you can subscribe worldwide, but I'm tracking this, and it's good insurance to say. So You can contact me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. You can go to my website, worldaffairsbrief.com, and it tells you right on the front page how to get a free sample copy. And you can also comment to me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com.
Thanks very much, Joe. Have a great day and enjoy your family in the United States of America, sir.
Thank you very much, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye.